So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on Trinity's Bicentennial Day 2024. I'm so honored to be here with you and with some incredible panelists that all bring a different perspective to our topic today. And so many of you know that I've been working on sort of the intersection between neuroscience and nature for a number of years. And that's why I proposed this panel today titled Wilding the Mind and Minding the Wild, Nourishing Our Connection to Nature. And just to share with you the amazing panelists, we have Chelsea Armistead, who is my former student and research assistant, is currently an early childhood educator. Reverend Dr. Lisa Dayhill, who works at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. She's the Miriam Therese Winter Chair for Transformative Leadership and Spirituality. The other panelists I invited, that I'll be representing them or sharing with you something about them, are Terry Delahanty. She's an American Indian, a native elder, and currently the spiritual counselor at the York Correctional Institution. And I have a clip to share with you about Terry, and also Alberto Ihuera, who's an Army combat veteran and retired police officer, and a member of the Burlington Land Trust, and also Christine Tappan, who's a social worker and executive leader and a guide with the Association for Nature and Forest Therapy. And she's actually here all the way from New Hampshire. And I really want to thank all of my panelists again, and thank you for coming here today. I just want to give a few introductory remarks, and then I would like to turn it over to my panelists to share their perspectives with you. And the two introductory remarks that I want to give are the same things that I say at every talk. And the first point, really simple, we really need nature. It's provided us with everything that we have now and everything that we'll need in the future, unless we move to Mars. So I don't see that happening, and I'd rather stay here because it's beautiful and all the people I love are here. And we can't forget this, because no matter how much renewable energy we install, no matter whatever we do, this is an irreducible part of our lives. And the other thing, as a neuroscientist, I know that we really need healthy brains to be all that we can be and want to be and can be for other people and everything in our communities. And this is also something that sometimes we lose track of. So I would say that from looking at this question from a number of perspectives for many years, these are not foundational properties upon which we make public policies. And so it's something we really need to think about. You know, what are the things we really need, and how do our public policies support them? So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And one of the things that I've come to realize is that we absolutely need areas that are dedicated to natural processes, the dynamic evolution of natural processes, all the interconnections among all the species we know about and those that we haven't even discovered yet. And so one of the points of that are we need areas that are really prioritized for these natural processes, which are so powerful and so magical. And so the term that I'm going to use for that is wildlands. And when I try and think about our public policies and our what are we doing where and why, I've kind of divided it into three buckets: nature, research, and resources. So these are kind of, I would say, three things that we need to keep in mind all the time. And but we can't forget this one. We can't forget the nature part. And so sort of the impetus for this panel was not only these amazing people, but also a report that I'm a co-author on. It just came out middle of last year, called Wildlands in New England, Past, Present, and Future. And this report goes through what's the land history in New England, what's the science associated with these wildland areas, and where are these areas now that have a specific intent to be prioritized for nature. And that's really important because it's a refuge for us and for all species, and there's so many benefits, and this report is fully available online, and it goes through the flooding, the climate stability, the species, the spiritual beauty, and all of that. And so I would encourage you to check that out. And the report defines wildlands basically in the common sense way that I just described to you, someplace that's prioritized for nature. So what I want to just tell you before I kind of invite my panelists to share their perspectives is that we have relatively little land in New England that's currently allocated as what we would think of as a nature preserve or a national park kind of area. So if you look at this chart, what you can see is in the dark red is developed areas, and this is for all of New England. Dark red is developed, yellow is agriculture, light green is unconserved forest, so we have a lot of forests in New England, and medium green is conserved forest, so that could be multi-use for recreation, it could be for timber, it could be for experiments, it could be for a whole range of things. So we need land that's associated with this kind of multi-use sort of opportunities. And then if you look at what is the land that's really dedicated to nature, the wildlands I was just telling you about, it's just 3.3% of New England. So most of the land that we see as being natural areas, they don't really have a specific intent for that. And we need to be really proactive about deciding what we're doing where and why, so we can get our resources from the areas that it makes sense, and we can protect nature in areas where that makes sense, like our headwaters, our old growth forests, our wildlife corridors, our special habitats, and places that people love and need for their brain health. So in New England, just 3.3% that we've been able to identify in this report is prioritized for natural processes. That's not nearly enough. It's a shatteringly low number. And the worst news is that, the good news, I'll tell you, I always like to try the good news first. The good news is 77% of the landscape is forested. So we can solve this problem if we try and allocate either some of the multi-use forests or some of the unconserved forest into this kind of prioritized for nature status, those special areas I was just telling you about. So we have a tremendous opportunity to handle this situation. In Connecticut, if we want to look at what are the current areas in Connecticut that we've been able to find, and we may have missed pieces, so if you know someplace that is intended as a natural area, please let me know. I want to get it on this map. In Connecticut, it's less than 1% of our landscape actually is prioritized for nature. And the worst news, so I've told you the good news, the bad news, and now the worst news, is that most of that protection is temporary. It could be reversed with a pen swipe or a change of policy, etc. So it's only 0.25% of our landscape that I've been able to find, and I worked with a team, has an explicit intent for natural processes long term. And most of it is just, it's little scraps in northwestern Connecticut. This is an issue that has consumed me for about 10 years. And that's why I wanted to bring it to this hallmark event today at Trinity's Bicentennial, because it's for everyone. And I know this means a lot to my students. I know this means a lot to my community. I know it means a lot to scientists. And we can't solve this problem unless we face it. So if we want to look at where are these wildlands in Connecticut, all of the wildlands with current permanent or temporary protection are in light green. This is all of southern New England. You can see the Appalachian Trail is a little yellow thread going through Connecticut and Massachusetts here. And what you can see are the areas that have an explicit intent for natural processes are just these little green specks here. This is not a network wherein species can migrate or everyone can find a refuge easily that they can count on when they want some peace and quiet or just want to see the beauty of our natural heritage. We need to expand these areas, connect them, and we need more areas. Hartford is blank. We have old growth forests in Hartford. They should be on this map. So the worst news is that if we remove the areas that just have temporary protection, which are colored on this map according to their different ownership, Connecticut is blank. And so we can't leave our entire landscape open to experiments in timber harvesting and other kinds of things that we do with our land. We need nature as our long-term ecological lifeline. It's for everything, for climate stability, for our mental health, for all the species and everything. So that's the message, on this wonderful bicentennial day that I want to tell you that we need to kind of talk about. I can't do this myself. I need other people to understand this and to talk about it. And to bring this to you today, I've picked the best people that I could find that are really frontline workers in this issue, that it means so much to all of them. And the first person that I'd like to introduce, who couldn't be here, I just talked to him on the phone. His dad had an accident and fell last night, is Alberto Higuera. He's a retired police officer, an Army combat veteran, and he contacted me just out of the blue after I had an article that appeared in the paper. And he told me, I really liked what you wrote in the paper because I have severe PTSD and time in nature is what has healed me. And it's what keeps me together on a daily basis. And so we've spoken at length about what this means to him. And he said the VA is actually starting to prescribe more time in nature and other kind of alternative opportunities. He's a member of the Burlington Land Trust. And so what I did, kind of like at a sports game, when people come out and they have their theme song, for every one of our panelists, I picked a special picture for them. So this is Alberto's picture, Al, and this is a beautiful picture, which is a property at the Burlington Land Trust. So he's going to be asking the Burlington Land Trust if there are any properties that they have that could get on this wildlands map, and then therefore give everyone in the community the assurance that that property will be there for them when they want a place for refuge and for their own peace, etc. And for Al to be able to count on, which is something that's really important to him. I hope he'll be able to come to a future event, and he sends his deepest regrets. The second person that I'd like to introduce to you is Terry Delahanty. And I met Terry because I called into a radio show and mentioned actually the premiere of an old growth forest movie a few years ago. And that movie is by New England Forests. And I'll be telling you about another premiere later in this session. But a friend of Terry's heard the premiere on the radio, wrote it down, called Terry. They contacted me, and we had a meeting, and they said, we really, really care about this old growth forest issue, and thank you so much for bringing this movie to us. And so Terry and I have kept in touch. She has a sweat lodge in Torrington on the second Saturday of every month. Everyone's welcome if you want to go. There's a little potluck afterwards, and everyone is welcome at her home and to her sweat lodge. She's been variously a teacher at the magnet school next to the river in Hartford. As I mentioned, she's currently the spiritual counselor at York Correctional Institution. And has a whole bunch of accolades in her tribe. She's Cree in Ojibwe. She's just a phenomenal person, and she grew up in Farmington. And she said basically that the river really saved her life when she was struggling at points in her life. She said going to the river was always the thing that renewed her. And Terry and I are in a movie together that's now available on YouTube. And so I didn't have a clip of Al, but I do have a clip of Terry. So before I turn it over to our other panelists and who can speak for themselves, I'm going to start off with a clip of Terry Delahanty from the movie Temptation of Trees.
So this is a prayer for all that needs healing. So this is Sunnybrook Park in Torrington, Connecticut, and it's one of my favorite places to come. It really connects me to Earth, to universe, to all that is, and because it's pretty much untouched. They leave fallen trees down, and they clean the trails a little bit, but pretty much it's an untouched forest, and I appreciate that. There's that medicine wheel, and there are elders that know exactly where everything is placed on that medicine wheel. The trees are on that medicine wheel. The giraffe is on that medicine wheel. The bobcat is on that medicine wheel. The water, the leaves, all of creation is on that medicine wheel. And it's our obligation to be a part of that medicine wheel, not to think we're the center of this medicine wheel, and to think that these are just resources. They're not resources, they're beings. They have communication. We call it nature, we call it the environment, we call it the wild, but we are part of that sacred hoop. We are not the center of that sacred hoop. And it's places like this that reminds me of that. This is not a resource for me. This is a relative. And as much as I take care of our relatives, they take care of us. It is that true reciprocity. It's all designed for thriving life, to continue on for the next generation of its own. And if all we have to do is appreciate it, that's all we have to do is appreciate it and bring our children there and our grandchildren there and ourselves there, most importantly.
So that was Terry, and if you would like to meet her, there is an event on March 27th at St. Joseph's University. It's a film called The Politics of Beauty, and that'll be a free event. So I'm just mentioning this now so I don't forget to tell you. And so I'm so pleased that I had that clip of Terry to share with you. And now I'd like to pass the microphone over to Lisa Dayhill from Hartford International University and invite her to share some of her thoughts about what this means to her.
So grateful to be here for this great event and to celebrate Trinity's bicentennial by wanting to honor and invite us out into this magnificent wild world. And really, Terry has said it all, like the rest of us don't need to say anymore, right? It's so just resonating so powerfully with her words and witness. So as Susan noted, I teach at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, which is just north of here, the former Hartford Seminary. It's a graduate school of theology, interreligious graduate school of theology. And I was hired to bring an eco-spirituality focus to the curriculum and to invite people outdoors, you could say. So I direct a graduate certificate in eco-spirituality, which any of you are welcome to come join us in taking classes for this certificate if you're interested. Creating eco tracks through all of our degrees so that you can now become an eco chaplain and do eco interreligious studies. And we're just beginning a new Doctor of Ministry for people of all faiths or no faith, who including a track in eco-spirituality as well. So I wanted to just read a little bit from a talk I gave in Sydney, Australia, actually, that describes an outdoor encounter and how that opens up my own spirituality. So this is a story from 12 years ago, and then I'll just say a little about it at the end. A story from 12 years ago. I spent Advent, I come from a Christian background, Christian season of Advent, which is in December, at a place called Holden Village, a Lutheran community in the remote Cascade Mountains of north central Washington. One of the most memorable encounters of my month there took place on a ridge far from the village. Awestruck by range after range of mountains that opened up in all directions, this is this place where you can't drive there, you can't fly there. You take a boat for 3.5 hours up a lake, and they send a bus down from the mountain. So it's astonishing. I suddenly also noticed bear tracks on the trail. Fresh since that morning's snowfall, the tracks were coming toward me, their bear maker now between me and the village several miles away. I noticed my animal senses alert, hairs rising, ears tracking every sound around me, breath poised, even before my brain quite registered what I was seeing. And in the Sydney talk, I actually showed, I should have thought of this, to show the slide that in the snow shows the bear track first, and then deciding that turning back was the smart move for a hiker far from the village, near an active bear, I was startled to see my tracks now overlapping with the bear's in the snow, its claws emerging from my boot. I had a picture of that too. Suddenly I am the bear, shambling along this morning, sharp and musky and fat with fall, senses open to creatures and climate, and I am the human spooked, something ancient of animal in me come alive. Suspended toward this bear, with its mind and life in these near woods. Something fierce and wild could meet me here. These lines from a poem I wrote after the bear track hike describe this disorienting shove of this experience out into the wildness of, quote, a God who is alien, not mine, not human, and not safe. Animal speaks to animal. That focused ferocity in me that lives its life outdoors, outside human purview, has strong jaws. All the way back down the mountain, I was alert, to say the least. And the world that bear open to me is the one I still live in, a world of alert attention to a sort of horizontal transcendence, is the language I'm playing with lately. A sense of horizontal transcendence. This world suddenly and fully alive with intelligence is different from mine. The world, in fact, holy, in a way that reveals simultaneously my radical vulnerability to other creatures and forces and my utter belonging and participation with it all. It is what eco-philosopher David Abram calls the experience of the more than human world. So just one more sentence. This was our ancestors' normal way of being in the world, now almost completely lost to us as we have created systems that attempt to hide that vulnerability to the world and killed off the apex predators who incarnate it. But I wanted only more and more. So the paper goes on from there. But that experience was what first blew me open, and I couldn't come back inside. So this sense of the divine is now fully outdoors. And how can our religious structures and traditions and systems stretch back out, recover aspects of their own wildlife that we may have forgotten, or create new ones that reconnect us with this wild divine presence that's very different from the one in human image that lives in rooms. Not to belittle someone's spirituality, but I want a bigger sense of the divine that takes place outdoors in these intact wild places. So the photos here show, the one on the right is from an encounter. I moved here 1.5 years ago, and last summer, a year after I'd moved here, I was out on the Farmington Trail on my bike, and somebody coming the other way said, bear, and we stopped, and people on the other side stopped, and this family of bears was in the trail. And it was magical, but also it was the first time since I moved here that I experienced again this sense of being blown out into the fullness of it all, and remembering, oh yeah, I can live here too as part of the wild, as a wild animal, as part of this whole ecosystem. And the river then on the left, the Farmington River, as a place of of refuge, of being able to return to a somewhat like flowing intact sense of a larger biosystem right here near my home. So I need that sense of wild holiness, horizontal transcendence. Intelligence is alive in all directions that transcend me. The sense of apex predators being around, there's a reason it was bears that creates this sense of vulnerability, that we're not at the top and don't belong there. Our attempts to establish dominance have been fatal to ourselves and the world. It's not going well, right? And also this sense of profound belonging and beauty and mystery and miracle. So we need spiritualities that are wild enough to be able to allow us to create new forms of human life on this earth. The ones we have are not working. The religions we have are not working to connect us to all of that. Much as I love my own tradition, it's not succeeding in reconnecting in the ways we need. We need wild new spiritualities. And for that, we need wild lands that help us, that invite us into that. So, yeah.
So before I turn the floor over to Chelsea, and please think of any questions you have for me or any of the panelists at the end. I did bring, because some of you may know that we do have bears in Connecticut. I live in Simsbury right now, which is the bear capital of Connecticut. And through my Grange, I've bought a whole bunch of bear deterrent whistles. So, you know, if a bear is minding its own business, or is in the woods, or just passing by, just leave it alone. But if it's like looking for food, or in the trash, or something like that, first we need to remove the attractants that bring them to our neighborhood. And second of all, if they are there getting food, we can deter them. So as a special present for my Connecticut panelists, I have a bear whistle for Lisa, just in case. Yeah, we want to keep bears wild and keep people safe. So, and there's a great site, ctbears.org, which goes through kind of a bunch of common sense information and sort of explains animal behavior. So bears aren't looking for us. The black bears around here don't care about us at all. They're really just looking for food, like a gigantic garbage disposal. And they're lazy, so if they don't find food, they're not going to keep on coming around. That's really all they're looking for. So remove the food, and if one has a habit of snooping around, just be persistent about deterring it, and then it will stay in the woods. And I'll just tell you, it's worked for me. I had a dinner bell, giant one, that I imagined as a mom that my kids would be running around until dark, and I'd have to ring the dinner bell, and they would come in. That never happened. This is my fantasy of being a mom, but I was always working, and I don't even know what the kids were doing. Who knows? They're doing fine now. But when there was a bear in our trash, my daughter called from upstairs, and she said, "Mom, there's a bear in the trash." And it was like an instinct. I'm going past my front door, I grabbed that dinner bell, I ran towards that thing like a lunatic. There has not been a bear in my neighborhood since. And my neighborhood, my daughter was looking at this horrible scene from upstairs, and she said, "Mom, all the neighbors think you're crazy." And I said, "Good, that's good." Because they were just looking at the bear. One of them was holding a snow shovel from about 50 feet away. So that was not a good strategy. So just make noise and just be persistent. So thank you so much for that. The next person I'd like to introduce you to is Chelsea Armistead, who was a psychology major here at Trinity, and she graduated, and I saw her in the library, and I realized she lives in my town. And it was just when I was embarking on a fellowship at Harvard called the Charles Bullard Fellowship in Forest Research. So Chelsea and I started working together on that and have kept in touch since. And I realized the first day that we talked about this that it really meant a lot to her, and she just really understands it. And before I turn the floor over to her, I'll just share my favorite quote. Is when I said, "Well, yeah, we need some of these forests to just be natural areas." And she said, "Well, yeah, you can't just keep on cutting a forest like it's a haircut." And I was like, exactly, you get it. So please, Chelsea.
I did not know that I said that, and that stuck with you. But that's wonderful. That actually That makes me feel really good. Like Dr. Messino said, I'm Chelsea. I'm a early childhood educator. I'm currently a preschool teacher, but I have worked with children between the ages of 3 months and basically 5 for a very long time. I am a mom to a 15-year-old boy. Teens are definitely not my population, but I am learning to roll with it. I have spent some time teaching at Holcomb Farm, at Flamig Farm. I was part of a micro school, and I was telling some of our panelists earlier before we started that I actually saw some of my previous students today at our farm. I work at Wintonbury Early Childhood Magnet School, and we take a trip about every 3 weeks to our farm in Bloomfield. And it just so happened that I saw a previous teacher that I worked with and my students, and it just all feels very symbolic and like everything is coming together. But seeing children out in nature and being able to explore on their own and being able to teach them about different kinds of trees, like yes, they're all trees. They're not all the same, and different type of leaves. And seeing them build forts and dams and just really exploring has made such an impact on me, and I know that it's made a really large impact on them. Watching them just thrive and being creative and being able to explore and ask questions is something that you can do in a classroom, but when you're doing it out in nature, it's a completely different experience. And I think that Lisa did such a beautiful job describing the experience that you had. And if I had words like that to describe my own experiences, I certainly would. Being out in nature, for me, I definitely get a sense of clarity. I get connection. I feel humbled by nature. And in the experiences some negative experiences in my life, I have found that I have returned to the woods. I grew up in Northford, which is a very small town here. So I was constantly in the woods. I was surrounded by farms and fields. And I find that as an adult, I tend to return when I'm having, difficult times in life. But I think my own experiences and like getting my son exposed to nature and just being a teacher now to new and little different faces and bringing them out into nature and even on farmland has really made a solid impact on my own life and theirs. As Dr. Messino said, I did do some research with her on the Harvard fellowship, and we ended up doing a survey that was done through a consulting service. We had over 2,000 respondents. We did this back in 2019. We had 2 different separate batches of data or results, so they were replicated. The survey was completely anonymous, and it was approved by the Trinity College Institutional Review Board, so it was approved. We didn't just kind of wing it. The goal of this survey was to better understand the public's priorities and knowledge of both public and private forests. There was a little incentive for those that took this survey, but everyone was given a screening question, and that was, do you care about forests in southern New England? Graphically, there were ages between 18 and then over 60. So our largest age group was 30 to 45. And then actually the lowest age group, which was 18 to 30, actually was higher than those over 60, which I thought was very, very interesting. We found out that there's a very high level of support for both public and private forests. And the public does agree that public money should be spent protecting public land and prioritizing as a nature preserve. We found that the highest concerns were about habitat fragmentation, accumulated human disturbance, so like litter or dirt bikes, disturbance to nature itself, chemicals, logging, and damage to water quality. Surprisingly enough, people were not really concerned about themselves. So ticks or poison ivy, anything that would be personal to them, it was more about what was happening to nature and the space itself. One of the strongest values that was said in the survey was scenic beauty, quality of life, and getting away from it all. So those are the things that people really valued when they go out into these public or private forests. It was even stronger than hiking and recreation. So just enjoying the scenic beauty. A vast majority of people want a natural forest they can count on to visit, as Al has said, that he enjoys the Torrington and just having that consistent area to return to get that peace, to get that humbling experience. And they want to make sure that there are also these spaces for scientists, educators, and children to be able to explore and experiment and have these areas as a resource to count on. Over 99% of the respondents support legal protection for old growth forests, and also over 99% support some forests with a forever wild clause. Lastly, over 99% said that if they owned a forest, they would hope it would be a place for people and all species indefinitely to be exposed to and have access to. So in closing, there's a lot more data that I have that I could totally ramble on about analyses and data and numbers. But what I really want you to take away from my experience is that I hope that you take the time to just surround yourself in nature. And you don't have to go in with an agenda. You don't have to go in with, I'm going to hike 3 miles and then I'm going to turn around and get back in my car and go to Starbucks. Just go out there and just see what you feel and invite someone, especially a younger person. I'm an advocate for younger children, and just having them, you don't need to bring an iPad, you don't need to bring anything out there, just bring yourself, and maybe you can ask questions or just point out noticing things, whatever you notice, or I wonder about. That's a really big thing in my classroom. What do you wonder about while we're experiencing, even being on the playground? So I want to thank Susan. Thank you so much. Dr. Messino, I've always called her Dr. Messino, not Susan, for having me on this panel. Thank you all for listening as I continue to ramble on. And I'm going to turn it over to Christine. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chelsea. And I just want to point out I was a little bit late at getting your sports star theme picture up here, but this is a picture in Simsbury, not too far from where Chelsea and I live. There are some beautiful, beautiful places there. And Chelsea's actually a perfect segue to our final panelist, Christine Tappan. And I will give the floor over to Christine, who can further introduce herself and share her perspective.
I am, it was very much worth the drive to come down from New Hampshire today. I'm really excited to meet the folks on the panel and to encourage this kind of conversation as much as I can. So I am currently a Health and Human Services executive here in New England. I actually work for one of the largest and oldest nonprofits here in New England. It's called the Centria Care Alliance. Here in Connecticut, you know it mostly in terms of our senior care that we do. They're called the Lutheran homes. Whenever you see a Lutheran home, that's a Centria Care Alliance. We have about 2,000 staff throughout New England. I oversee all of our community-based programs, so I don't oversee the senior care. It is an amazing collection of programs and services across 5 of the 6 New England states that really, for those of you who are familiar with the determinants of health, we really do programs that cut across to all of that, everything from housing to food services, counseling, mental health, developmental disabilities. We are one of the largest refugee resettlement organizations in New England as well. So we're often working with folks in very vulnerable situations, including our staff, honestly. I have, in my background, I have, I think, a very circuitous journey and relationship with nature. Like has been shared previously, I as a child, and maybe like many of you, I spent the majority of my childhood in nature. I grew up in Michigan, south central Michigan, in an area called the Irish Hills. I grew up on a little lake called Mud Lake, but it was lovely. The name didn't matter. I spent my days fishing, and we would eat that for dinner. I went hunting with my dad. I ate a lot of venison as I grew up. I grew up very much in and with nature. It was my friend. I had a disability as a child and wasn't able to walk for the first few years of my life, and my mother would sit me under the branches of a willow tree at the shore of our lake, and I would literally sit there for hours. And when I forgot about those experiences, and Throughout my career, I'm a trained social worker, as Susan mentioned, and I have spent my career working with in a variety of settings, and frankly, I've had the opportunity to work around the world. And throughout those experiences in social work, in the health and human services space, we often talk about self-care. So we have this, what we call our self-care, it's kind of cliche, our self-care toolkit, right? And as a psychologist, you've probably, heard about some of this, things like make sure you eat well, sleep well, have social connections. Also things like, encouraging yoga, meditation, and being out in nature is touched on, but it is really not common to be discussed as part of a self-care toolkit. So throughout my career, I've had some very, very intense roles. A lot of my work has been child welfare, child protection, juvenile justice, working with individuals with serious mental illness. I'm also a veteran. I actually helped to create, when we moved from to manage healthcare in New England here, transitioning from what was called Champus to now what has been called TRICARE for the last 25 years. I actually worked with the VA system throughout New England and set up the whole healthcare behavioral network. And at the time as a veteran, I even realized back then, growing up with all of that nature in my life, my first job was actually going into the military. I went into the Army. To date myself, for those of you who recognize the dates of the Cold War, I actually served in military intelligence in Germany when there was a Cold War, and we were behind the wall. And really, I was comfortable doing that in large part, I know, because I had spent time in nature. I didn't have fears, which a lot of folks in the military at that time had a lot of fear. They weren't used to being out in the woods and really trying to forage and make do with the limited supplies and things at your fingertips. And this was even before technology got in our way of that. It's more profound now, even more so. So in my 25 plus year career, in 2019, I had been appointed by Governor Sununu in New Hampshire to serve as an associate commissioner of the Department of Health and Human Services there in New Hampshire. I'd been in the role for close to 3 years, and we had a lot of very significant and serious issues. It's certainly, unfortunately, still going on. Our substance use crisis, the opioid crisis, mental health crisis. New Hampshire has been touched profoundly and frankly was caught off guard by how profoundly we were affected. Third highest level of substance use disorders and death in the country for many years. And at that time, it was not unusual for me to come into work and open up my email. It was a 24/7 job, but when I opened up my email, usually at about 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, it wasn't unusual to have multiple emails indicating GSW, gunshot wound, double homicide, child death. And it was at a point in my career where I was also having some personal things. My mother had become very ill. My father-in-law had become very ill. And my buffer was gone. I had no buffer. I had nothing left in my cup to sort of build my resilience. And so I tried to go to that self-care toolkit. I thought, okay, therapy is one of those things. And I realized my husband had tried to say to me, look, I'm noticing you're not eating very well. You're not sleeping very well. You often seem kind of edgy. And right, most of us, sometimes we listen to our partners. A lot of times we don't. It was really two colleagues at work. When I went into work one day, two colleagues asked to meet with me. And they sat me down and they said, look, you have been a really wonderful leader. You tend to be really, we can come to you with all sorts of challenging issues. You ask us about data. You help us think through solutions. You help us really understand the problem more deeply. You help us figure out how we need to partner with others. And you're not here for us. You can't seem to make a decision. You keep asking us some of the same questions. You often don't seem like you're listening. And I realized that my executive functioning had taken a real plummet. And I just wasn't emotionally there for people. And so I went through EAP, our Employee Assistance Program, and I tried to do talk therapy. And much as Alberto might have done with post-traumatic, I tried an evidence-based practice called EMDR. That's rapid eye movement, and I tried it. And with my second session, I just realized talking was not the thing that was going to help me. I couldn't really even verbalize what was going on. And so I kept thinking to myself, I need to get away. I asked my boss, can I get away? I need a vacation. He's like, sure, take what time you need. I didn't know where to go or what to do. And someone who I was explaining this to encouraged me to look towards Kripalu out in the western Berkshires of Massachusetts. I'd never heard of it. I'm not really into yoga. I've done it here and there, but I'm not a big yogi. But I got online and I looked at it and I found that they had a 5-day forest bathing program. And I'm just curious, how many people before today have heard of forest bathing? Okay, that's not too bad. Actually, this is a little bit more, it's not unusual for me to have one person or no one raise their hand. And so I went to that program, and I happened to have taken a picture before I left. And when I got there within the first, we literally that evening, we started by an outdoor evening sunset, sort of coming together and meeting our coaches for the week. And I immediately just sitting there in the presence of that space, just being in that land, understanding those that had come before me there. And it just so happens that across the street is the, now I'm going to forget the name of it, is Tanglewood. And my relatives, I'm a Tappan, our relatives are actually part of Tanglewood. And I was just feeling this very deep connection. I actually slept almost through the night that first night. I got up the next morning, I actually ate. I was realizing already that I was settling. And by the end of the week, I felt literally like a completely different person. And I came home and I came in the door to my family, and my 2 sons happened to be there with my husband. And they all 3 of them stood there sort of stunned. And I'm like, what? And they're like, you don't realize how different you look. It's almost like all the stress and strain had melted off of me. And really, it was during that week I experienced what is now an evidence-based, and here's the first collection of the literature on it. It's an evidence-based practice, forest therapy, forest bathing. It comes out of Asia. And in that week, I experienced six different instances of spending 3 to 4 hours in nature, being taken through a protocol I wasn't really even noticing, a series of what are called invitations to notice, to open my senses, to really just be present there. As Chelsea was mentioning, she was actually mentioning some of the elements of what you do. One of the most critical pieces of it is what's called a sit spot. It's just finding a place that you come back to on a regular basis, and you really become connected with the beings in that space. And so during the week, we were coached and encouraged to find a spot, and I did. And on our free time, I went there as well. So during that week, I probably spent upwards of at least 40 hours in nature. Now, that's not something we can do all the time, right? But I became immediately curious about, even before COVID, people were leaving the health and human services profession at extraordinary rates, choosing to not come into it because of the low pay and the pressure and the stress, but leaving it. And even more since COVID, they have been departing in droves. And so I founded my own organization called Birch Walking. I became a certified guide, an international guide in forest bathing. And it has really compelled me to be rethinking on a constant basis my relationship, the biases, frankly, that I created in my mind by spending so much time of my life from early adulthood on inside, not outside. And I realized in many ways my children were the only ones that were taking me outside for many of my, my later 20s, 30s, and even into my 40s, how disconnected I had become. And so I really have taken a lot of joy in this journey that I've been on. It just so happened that during COVID, they offered this course online. I actually got trained virtually to learn how to do forest bathing, and believe it or not, you can do that. And the process really is, so it happened in Japan. It was really during the Great Recession that they noticed in the 1980s an escalation in anxiety and depression and a variety of health conditions, serious health conditions, heart disease, diabetes, and an escalation in suicide. And it was a call to action around nature by someone named Dr. Chi Ling, who really offered the opportunity for the first time. He's really an interesting person. I've never met him, but I've watched a lot of his videos and read several of his books. And he actually said, I wasn't really a very good doctor. I wasn't interested in diseases and diagnosing diseases. And I was often told in medical school, I probably wasn't going to make it. But what carried him through was this journey towards what he knew was wellness that people really wanted to find. And so he proposed to the government in the 80s, let me begin a small study of the connection between nature and human beings. And what he did is he went through a couple of decades of doing gradually more and more research about what is in nature, what's literally coming off the trees and out of the soil. And just really quickly, and it's easy to go online and find all of this wonderful information about it, but there's essentially those essential oils, those things that are coming off the trees are called phenicides. And when we breathe those phenicides into our bodies, they're actually doing things in a multitude of ways to our bodies, to our brains, to our minds. And one of the most important things that I think, particularly related to COVID, because there's now research going on of people doing intensive forest bathing who have long COVID. There's over a dozen universities in the UK studying this, is essentially it boosts our natural killer cells. It boosts your immune system. So not only does it lower the cortisol in the brain and boost dopamine and boosts our endorphins, so it's giving that, it's balancing our heart rate, it's actually giving us that little positive high in our brain. It's actually also resetting a lot of things in our nervous system. But in addition to that, it's actually making us more resilient in terms of our autoimmune systems. And so for me, that was just really exciting information. So the tree that I have here on part of my journey, I actually, as a guide in training, they ask you to do what they call a harvest project. And that's really to dig deeper into your understanding, your knowledge. How can you cultivate it, which I love the harvest project. I found my way to the Old Growth Forest Network, which Susan is part of as well. And in that Old Growth Forest Network, I became a county coordinator in New Hampshire. And this is where I came to know this whole new community of foresters and conservationists and a whole array of people. And that is with a wonderful tree friend, a large white pine in the back of Mount Sunapee, which is an old growth forest on one side of Mount Sunapee, and on the opposite side is a large ski area owned by Vail Resorts, right? It's like you're in two different worlds. And this was the first old growth forest I had ever experienced. And I was there with the team that was measuring these large old white pines. I'm thrilled to tell you this is now part of our Old Growth Forest Network, as is 3 more forests in New Hampshire. And this is where now I guide people, particularly health and human service professionals, and maybe, who knows, children and families soon too. But I would encourage you to just learn more about forest bathing and about forest therapy. As Chelsea said, it's not about hiking in the woods. It's really not about a destination. It's about finding a spot that's special, becoming very close to it, opening all of your senses. And if you have a chance to go with a guide, it is very unique. We're wilderness first aid trained and certified. We create that safe container. We watch out for the bears, so you don't have to. And you relax at a different level when you have someone else providing that protective space. So I just would encourage you to think about an opportunity. There are a lot of guides. Susan's going to be one soon, and maybe she'd be taking you out in this area. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That was amazing. So we have a few minutes left. I wanted to open the floor and see if anyone had any questions for any of our panelists, or any thoughts, or any places that are special to you. It's really kind of a very organic panel. Yes?
I have a question, sort of definitional. Old growth forest, does that mean the forest has never been cut and regrown, so that the trees there go back to the time that the sort of people settled in New England?
I can actually take that question. Yeah. So what you're talking about in terms of a forest that's never been cut at all, that would be called like a virgin or primary forest. So there are some little pieces that have never been cut. They tend to be like in ravines or little scraps here and there. And we've found actually more in recent years. There's not much, but there are some pieces, and those are incredibly precious. In terms of old growth forests, the Forest Service just released a new definition for this region, which is Region 9. And that definition, the threshold to meet that criteria, it depends on the type of forest, so the different species. but it starts at between 100 and 160 years, and there has to be a certain number of trees, which it's easy to meet that criteria, and then a minimum diameter of 12 to 20 inches for the tree size. So the forests here in Connecticut are some of the most carbon dense and oldest forests in New England, because there hasn't been a really active paper industry, timber industry in Connecticut. So we have a lot of forests based on that new definition that meet the criteria. We absolutely have forests in Hartford that meet that definition. The first forest in the old growth forest network in Connecticut, Belden Forest in Simsbury, meets that definition. There are trees there, eastern white pine, 164 years old. So we have some remarkable old forests, and this is a legacy that we have and need to not squander.
So your map that you showed originally, all state parks wouldn't be on.
So there are pieces of state parks and forests that are on that map. And the reason why they're on that map is they're currently designated as old forest management sites. So these are spots that the foresters in Connecticut have recognized are special old areas. They're not necessarily, I actually like to use the word old forest and not old growth. But even saying it's an old forest is a little bit of a misnomer, because if a tree falls over, new stuff can come up. It really has all kinds of ages. It's sort of immortal in a way, it's a self-sustaining system. But all of the state land that's currently on that map, which is really just some little bits, it's a very small subset, that's the kind of land that I was saying is temporarily protected by a current management plan. So it's also the type of area that I think should be permanently protected and expanded with a buffer around it, because the state really is the only type of land ownership that could really provide a statewide network of these kinds of places.
Could I just add something real quick too? So on my learning journey, one of the things I've also learned is, so logging or cutting obviously is a critical factor, but in New Hampshire, unfortunately, we also historically have experienced a lot of hurricanes, and, hurricanes will wipe out the forest. Diseases obviously will as well, and fire is the other thing. So forest fires and, learning about the history of New Hampshire's forests and what might have been old growth, we don't want to over give responsibility to the logging companies, right? Or sort of blame in some ways, or even landowners. As a landowner myself, I unfortunately cut my own land, 20 acres that abuts a 1,500 acre state park. I didn't know. I didn't have knowledge, and we cut our forest twice. And now when we go back and look, we cut trees, a couple that probably were more than 200 years old, and we did not know. And so I think for me, being part of the Old Growth Forest Network, and as I'm trying to do my own education learning, but teach others, it's all these factors, and trying to think in your own community, are you prone to fire? Are you near, it's always changing with where hurricanes are nowadays, but thinking about these other factors that influence our ability to maintain these forests. It's not just cutting, but that's obviously one of the major influencers.
Yes, Mark Silk.
So this is a question for Lisa. If a bunch of religious institutions came to you and said, you're a professor of this stuff, write us a project to get us outside, what would be on that? On your white paper, in your white paper.
Yeah. Well, I do think religious traditions have a great potential in this area, because they touch people at a very deep level. And so moving any tradition outdoors would be a great gift. And so what would be in that paper, I think, would depend on the communities involved, right? What resources are available in a given tradition. So in the Christian tradition, the practice of baptism began in the early church, and the baptism of Jesus in a river, right? Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River in the Bible. And the early church for hundreds of years baptized into rivers. And then when the Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire and everybody's Christian now and it all moved indoors and then it's in a little pool and then it's in a little bowl, right? A little bowl of tap water in a room is very different from being baptized into the actual river and all its fullness of life and all those creatures and this big sense of connection to the life of the world. So that's an example where if it were a Christian religious group, I can advocate for restoring rituals that already exist, or the Jewish ritual of the new moon was an outdoor ritual, and many Jewish traditions began as outdoor rituals. But in other cases, there might not be examples of like there. I am presently working in the Christian tradition on developing Eucharistic rites of Holy Communion that connect in an interspecies way and that are meant to be done outdoors, not indoors. So that hasn't existed in this way before. And so it's a matter of creating something new, but that's enough in line with the tradition that it feels like real church to people in this case. It has to feel like it works. So it's definitely always a creative project and always a contextual project based on what traditions are involved. But, and one more example. There's a fantastic video called Ethiopian Church Forests that was made by the New York Times about 5 or 8 years ago, 10-minute contemplative video about these Ethiopian Orthodox churches who have this belief that a church is not a church unless it's inside a forest. And so they've protected the forests from the original Ethiopian highlands around these churches and against agriculture, grazing, overgrazing, destruction of the forests. And so that's an example of what if all Christians had developed along those lines, and that all churches have to include intact, uncut, never pristine examples of the forest or whatever lived there. In order to be a church, you have to be surrounded by wild land. Like the boundary of the church it isn't the walls of the church, it's outside all of that, right? All of this is inside so what are examples in any tradition of these kinds of roads not taken or alternative ways of being this tradition?
Christians would have to get rid of their long-standing opposition to sacred
opposition to state, which is biblical as well. It didn't begin with the Christians, but yes, that's right. Yeah, there was, and that went away a long time ago. But definitely, when Christians came into a place traditionally in Europe, especially, their first act was to chop down the sacred groves, the places of outdoor religiosity and religious connection and divine presence in the pre-existing traditions, the indigenous traditions of Europe, because that's paganism. So we're opposed to that, right? So that's right. A new version of Christianity that does not find that to be a competitive threat, but a blessing.
Maybe one last question. Thank you.
It's a bit of a comment, not a question.
Please.
But I am aware of at least one traditional mainline Christian denomination that is exploring spirituality in the woods, and that would be the Episcopal tradition. There's a church in New Hampshire called Church of the Woods, and it's run by an Episcopal priest who gathers people every Sunday. My husband and I have been to this service, and you sit on stumps, and you're very casual. You just kind of maybe 5 or 10 minutes to this little round circle area on stumps. It's a very modified kind of Christian service, and one of the high points of it is I'm very simple. There's no fancy structures or fancy flat, anything like that. One of the high points of it is leaving this circle, going out into nature, and kind of giving thanks for something that you find. So just kind of walking for 10 or 15 minutes, coming back to that circle with something that you share and something that you say, and how this being outside in nature has impacted you spiritually. So if you're interested, it's called Church of the Woods, and you're a New Hampshire person, so maybe you'll have an opportunity someday to learn more about it.
Thank you. And actually, Church of the Woods is part of the larger Wild Church Network, which is a movement across North America, including many Canadian parishes as well, and in parts of the UK. So it's not just in the Episcopal Church, but many Christian traditions, interfaith bodies, non-religious. It's called Church of the Wild, but there are communities that are not Christian in this network as well. So the Wild Church Network that includes Church of the Woods. Yeah, thank you.
And I know we're really short on time, but I just encourage you, as it is Black History Month, I actually recently learned about camp meetings where previously enslaved people gathered traditionally in a Christian background, and it would all be outdoors where they would commune and sing. And it wasn't necessarily about a service, but it was about singing and communing with food after they filled their souls, by gathering with all the people and just singing. And again, it was just all outdoors. There were baptisms that happened. So I just encourage you to do research on camp meetings in your own time. I just wanted to add that in there. And happy Black History Month, everyone.
Thank you, Chelsea. And just before we close and thank our panelists, I just wanted to let you know that we're having the world premiere, actually, because it's going to Germany next, of a film all about New England. Some of it was filmed here in Hartford, called The Return of Old Growth Forests. It's going to be at Cine Studio, free, on March 20th. 7 o'clock. I'll be there, and filmmaker Ray Aslin, who's very humble and quiet, but he actually filmed this panel for us today, and I want to thank him profusely for that. And if you come to this, it's mind-boggling. Thank you, everyone.
Camp meetings.